everyone. I'm Hope from the Daphne Blake Team. If you've been following our channel, you know that we've been focused on the murders of Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch. They were three 8-year-old boys who were murdered on May 5th, 1993 in West Memphis, Arkansas. In 1994, three teenagers were convicted of their murders. Jesse Kelly, Jason Baldwin, and Damian Eccles pled not guilty and have maintained their innocence. Eccles was sentenced to death while the other two were sentenced to life in prison. All three went through several appeals and all were denied. In 2007, there was some DNA testing on evidence that was found at the crime scene. None of the DNA they tested matched any of the three convicted. However, DNA from two hairs found at the scene was consistent with two other people that were known in the case. One was Stevie's stepfather, Terry Hobbs, and the other was David Jacoby, who was a family friend of Terry and Pam Hobbs. The defense subsequently asked for a retrial. In 2008, Judge Burnett denied this request, saying that neither the DNA present nor the lack of DNA from the defendants was proof that they were not guilty. In November 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a trial court judge to determine if the three convicted should be given new trials or even be exonerated. While awaiting that decision, the state and the defense attorneys came to an agreement to dispose of the case. On August the 9th, 2011, the three convicted took Alford Pleas and were released from prison. Today, we want to discuss these pleas and how they have affected this case. I'm being joined by Rose, who is a criminal defense attorney. Hi, Rose. Thanks for joining me.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Let's jump right into the case, if that's okay. Can you explain to us in words we can understand what exactly is an Alford plea?
Sure. So an Alford plea or an Alford plea is something that essentially allows a defendant to maintain their innocence while also pleading guilty. This is not something that's always been available because at the end of the day, whenever you're pleading guilty to something, typically it is because you're admitting guilt. And in fact, when you do a guilty plea under normal circumstances, the judge will actually ask you, at least in my jurisdiction, the judge will ask the defendant, are you pleading guilty because you are guilty and for no other reason? And one of the things that judges really want to make sure that they do during a plea on the record is make sure that somebody is pleading guilty not because they're being coerced to do so, that the only reason why they're doing so is A, because they are guilty, and B, because they are accepting a plea offer. That other than those two reasons, no one's forcing you to do this. They're really, and judges are doing this to try to protect defendants. It's to protect you.
Sure.
But in some situations, a person might be innocent of a crime, but still feel that it is in their best interest to take a plea. Well, before the offered plea was allowed by the Supreme Court, you're not allowed to do this because if you get in front of a judge and you say, no, I did not do this, but I want to plead guilty because I think I'm going to get convicted at trial or for what other reason, the judge wouldn't let you do it. So this is almost kind of like a compromise, a way for somebody to be able to plead guilty because they think that the state has enough evidence to convict them, or for whatever reason, they want to be done with it. It's personal choice, but they're going to maintain their innocence on the record. It's kind of a contradiction.
Yeah, it's very confusing. When I started reading about it several years ago, it's hard to wrap your head around why someone would take this, but then I've read about several cases where someone did take the offer plea, and it's becoming a little more clear to me. And I think in this case, from what I understand, they all three agreed mainly, well, one, because they'd been in prison for 18 years, but also because Damian Eccles was on death row and was facing execution. And so I think that they, the defense attorneys, as well as the state, use that as a way to get them to agree to this plea.
It is very often used as a bargaining chip after a trial after a conviction has been overturned. It's very commonly used in those situations. So post-conviction, you talk about it a lot. Somebody has maybe been convicted of a crime, maybe their conviction was overturned on appeal, maybe they're maintaining their innocence, maybe they have a really good actual innocence case. That is a really common negotiation tactic between the defense and the state. But it's not just limited to post-conviction. You can do an offered plea prior to trial.
Okay. Well, so obviously in this case, this was post-conviction. The question I always have, and I've never found really a satisfactory answer unless it's because Damien Eccles was, on death row, is the trial court judge that was ordered to review the case by the Arkansas Supreme Court was still doing so when they came to this agreement. And so I've always wondered why they didn't wait. Why didn't they wait for that decision before? I guess maybe they were going to take this off the table. Is that a possibility, that if you wait, we're not going to give you this plea anymore? Because they could have gotten a new trial or have been exonerated based on whatever this trial court judge decided, right?
My understanding, and I don't know the case as well as you, but my understanding is that that was part of it, is that the offer would have been withdrawn if they had gone through with the hearing. And so you run the risk of losing the hearing and then not having that offer on the table anymore.
Yeah, so that's a big gamble. Well, so that makes more sense as to why they decided to take the Alford plea.
Yeah.
Okay. So my next question is, obviously, an Alford plea, the defendant is saying they're guilty, even if they're maintaining their innocence, correct? They're still saying, I did this, or you have enough evidence to convict me.
Yes.
So is it possible for someone who takes this plea to be exonerated?
A lot of it is going to depend on the language of the plea, what you agreed to.
Okay.
And a lot of it will depend on what new evidence surfaces after that plea was entered, if that makes sense. So just kind of as an example, a regular plea, like just take the offered innocence claims out of it. A plea is essentially an agreement. It is a contract essentially between you and the government, where the government agrees to do certain things and then you agree to do certain things. And the main thing that you're agreeing to do is to plead guilty and to waive certain constitutional rights that you have. One of those rights being, in most cases, an appeal. You're waiving your right to a trial. You're waiving your right to remain silent. All of these things are constitutional rights that everybody has, and you waive those. And in exchange for that, the state agrees to recommend a certain punishment, and the judge agrees to follow that. Now, there's some situations where a judge can blow up a plea. We're not talking about those situations, but so I can totally see a situation in which you could contract away any right to later bring an innocence claim. I don't know what the language of this offered plea says.
From what
go ahead.
No, from what I understand, they would still be able to argue their innocence. And I have not read the whole thing. I've read excerpts. But from what I understand, they can't sue the state for wrongful conviction. So they wouldn't have a monetary gain if they were exonerated. But from what I understand, they still can present evidence that would exonerate them.
Okay, well, there's your answer. Then yes, they could still present an actual innocence claim and potentially prevail. They just can't take advantage of any kind of compensation package that the state might have.
Okay. Well, and there may be more to it. Like I said, I have not read the whole thing. So based on what you do know about the case or other cases in general, if someone has taken an Alford plea and there hasn't been, let's say there's in this case, there has been evidence presented, new evidence since the convictions, but that evidence was deemed, that it didn't amount to enough to be exonerated. So there's new evidence, but they have not been exonerated. So without actual innocence, without exoneration, can a case that has been basically closed, that there's been a plea agreement in, can that case be reopened without exoneration?
I mean, yeah, there's no reason why it couldn't be, because at least my understanding of your question is you're asking me, can police investigate it or can the DA's office investigate it? And yeah, they absolutely can.
But
there's no, but that's, yes, but will they? It's going to be more of a policy decision than anything else. There's no legal reason why anybody can't come back later and say, I have received new evidence. And people do this all the time. DA's offices do this all the time. We have cities all over the country that have conviction integrity units that's their only job is to review old cases where you've already obtained a conviction and see, should we reopen them? And so, yeah, absolutely. The DA's office could continue to investigate the case if they believed that justice required it. Will they? I don't know.
All signs point to no.
That's what I'm hearing. Yeah.
But we will see. There is a new DA in town, and we'll see how that goes. So
Yeah.
in general, or if you want to talk specifically about this case, what kind of evidence would you typically think is required in order to actually get the police or the district attorney to start reinvestigating a case they consider closed?
I actually don't have a whole lot of experience with district attorneys' offices on their own reinvestigating a case they had considered closed, other than in the context of, say, for example, a conviction integrity unit, where they, in those cases, and I've never worked on one of those before, but in those cases, my understanding, they either will get a case from, say, like an Innocence Project or an attorney, a defense attorney, the defense bar might bring them a case and ask them to review it. In Texas specifically, we have, like, for example, our Forensic Science Commission routinely puts out reports on, hey, here's a bunch of bite mark cases that we think might be suspicious. And so they might send those, the CIU might look at it, or they might send them to the Innocence Project to look at. So there are certain, like, kind of internal procedures, policies. It's mostly policy related, though. So it's going to be mostly like whatever internal policy that office might have. It could be a lot of different things. There's a lot of different examples. It could be a matter of, hey, there's been an advancement in science and we want to take a look at certain types of cases, or maybe a witness has recanted, or maybe there has been a CODIS hit on some other crime that raises some eyebrows. Right? Like I've heard of cases, for example, where, there might be a crime that we caught the guy, we thought, we had him convicted, we thought, but oddly, some other crime that had DNA involved, there was a CODIS match to this crime, and that doesn't appear possible based on what we thought happened. And so things like that do happen, and that might prompt somebody to reinvestigate a case.
Okay. So in this case, the prosecutors who have held office, or the DAs who have held office in this district since this conviction in 1994, have kept a lot of the evidence secret. Now there's a very well-known website called Callahan's, where lots and lots of documents and evidence have been posted publicly that anybody can go and look through. I've spent many hours there, but there's still a lot of things that are missing. So the questions I have about that is, one, if the case is considered closed, which from my understanding it is because of the plea, and there's been no real reinvestigation of the case since that plea, or the pleas, all three took a plea. I understand that it would make sense to keep very sensitive evidence secret. There, it was a horrible crime, 3 8-year-old boys. There's some really gruesome, photographs and facts of the case, but there's other things that I don't understand why people who are interested in the case wouldn't have access to. Can you think of any reasons why, if on a closed case, they would hold back information that could be useful to other people who are investigating the case?
I can't, honestly. And, this might be a question for somebody that does FOIA litigation,
yes,
or open records litigation. There's a whole group of attorneys that's their specialty. And, each state has the right to make their own laws in terms of what is public record and what isn't.
Sure.
If the general rule in most jurisdictions, is that if a case is closed and it's a matter of historical record at that point, then the public can have access to it. A lot of states, a lot of jurisdictions have laws that require certain evidence to be retained, certain biological evidence, for example, to be retained indefinitely.
Yes.
So, I mean, but can I think of a legitimate reason to hold it back other than it being sensitive information? No, but I guess it would really depend on what the information is. I've talked about this in other places, mostly regarding the federal government. I just believe that governments are not as transparent as they should be with their records and their historical files. For example, I strongly, strongly believe that the federal government overclassifies things. I think there are tons and tons and tons of things that are considered classified and are denied FOIA requests all the time, that there's no reason for it. There's no legitimate national security reason. There's just no reason. And oftentimes you look at this stuff that eventually does get released and it blows my mind. Like, I don't even, like, it's not like it was embarrassing or like,
Right.
I can't even fathom like why, other than it's just some kind of red tape bureaucratic decision that somebody made, and it's a nightmare trying to appeal that decision, you know? And so maybe it's just that, maybe it's more of a bureaucratic administrative, maybe no one's trying to hide anything and there's really nothing more nefarious than that. But no, I think that if the case is closed and no one is actively investigating it, and the state of Arkansas is confident that they have the right result, then it's a matter of historical record at this point, and everyone should be able to look at it. But that's just my own opinion.
I like your opinion. So obviously over the years, there's been pressure put on the district attorney's office and the police department from different places, from the defense attorneys. You know, there were several documentaries made about this case. So there were, you know, film crews and the people who were backing the documentaries. From that, there was another court case because a person was named as a possible killer, and he sued one of the Dixie Chicks. So there was a case there. So there's been public pressure put on various agencies in the state of Arkansas over the years. And so maybe some of that public pressure is what prompted the Supreme Court of Arkansas to ask for the case to be revisited, which of course we never heard what that opinion was because the three convicted took the plea. But I think it probably leans more towards the evidence that was presented, the lack of DNA, and then the DNA of the other two that were found. That's just my guess. I don't know. But do you think public pressure does sway a district attorney's office to re-examine a case, to reopen a case, that sort of thing?
To the extent that DA's constituents are putting pressure on him, yes. I mean, I get that it's a national case and it's
Sure.
a very, you know, I saw all the benefit concerts. It is a case that a lot of people know about internationally at this point. I don't think that any amount of pressure from anyone outside of that county is going to matter. What matters to the DA is who's voting for him.
Yep.
That is whose interests he represents, and that is whose opinions he is worried about.
Okay. Yeah, and I tend to agree with you too. And although, I mean, there's been a tremendous amount of pressure put on the district attorney's office by various people, and I don't know how much good it did or how much harm it did. But I tend to agree with you that what they care about is their constituents. And from, you know, what I've gathered, what I've read from people that I've talked to who live in the area, you know, there are a lot of people who still believe that the three who were convicted are guilty. And it's probably just because, you know, they haven't really dug into the case, or, you know, it's easier to believe they got the right people the first time. I don't know, but I think there is a decent percentage of the population there that doesn't believe the case needs to be reexamined.
Well, consider too that if you live somewhere locally, your small town, your small county, you do things the way you do things, you've done them that way for years and years, and then all of a sudden, everyone in Hollywood, everyone from all across the country that thinks that they're better than you and they know things better than you are telling you how to do things there and telling you got something wrong, telling you that you don't know what you're talking about. That matters too.
Yeah.
And I mean, it being a nationally recognized case, it being a case where there's national pressure, I think that it can be good and bad. It's good because if it is getting so much attention, then investigators, journalists, people will dig more into it, and there will be information out there that wouldn't otherwise be, so that somebody who may live locally, if they want more information about it, they can go online, they can watch a documentary, they can watch a podcast. There are things out there because so many people are interested in it, and because it's this whole cause now, right?
Mm-hmm.
But also the flip side of that is, I mean, you live in a small town in the South and a bunch of Hollywood elites are telling you that, you bumpkins down there don't know what you're doing, and you were caught up in a moral panic, and you don't know what you're doing, don't know how to investigate. I can also see that going the other way, and somebody doubling down in their beliefs because of that.
Yeah. And I get that. That makes perfect sense. So if you have an opinion, what kind of approach do you think would work in order to persuade the district attorney's office to take another look at the case?
In this case specifically?
If you have an opinion.
I think that, I agree with what others have said, that at this point, it's going to take an advancement in forensic science and either that or true new evidence. I think that because over the years, there have been so much, I don't know if confusion is the right word, but there has just been so much, right? There's been new people coming forward. There's been new allegations made. There's been theory after theory after theory. And at the end of the day, if I'm the DA, I really want to prosecute somebody for this crime, and I want it to stick this time, and I want my constituents to be convinced that I had a really good reason for overturning 3 convictions and for putting somebody else in prison. I need to have a simple and compelling story. And a simple and compelling story generally comes with something like DNA. And I'm not saying that that's the only way. I'm sure that I don't know. Maybe, I'm sure that I could be convinced with other methods, but I'm just, knowing what I know about the local population there and the opinions there, and knowing what I know about how cases are prosecuted, I want something simple, easy to sell, easy to explain. Right?
And irrefutable.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is that it's gotta be something that makes sense to everyone.
Not really open to interpretation.
Correct. Yeah, because the past evidence that has been presented, there's the people who believe that the 3 that were convicted are guilty. They're called non-supporters online, and then there's the supporters. And it doesn't matter what piece of evidence you bring up, they both have a way to explain it. That's what I have found, because there's not really anything in this case that is concrete. Everything is open to interpretation. And I think that's one of the biggest problems with the case.
Even DNA to a certain extent is open to interpretation, not just in this case, but in any case.
Right. But say, for example, there were 2, 3, 4 different spots of the same DNA at the crime scene. And let's say that that DNA matches, 99% of the population. So not 99, but it excludes 99. Thank you. I said that backwards. So there's 1% out there. it could be somebody else. To me, that you're just piling on the evidence. I think there you're starting to get towards something that's irrefutable.
Well, so first thing you have to understand about DNA these days is that you can take, if you have a good enough sample, you can exclude so much of the population that it's really just that one person, right?
Yes.
Like you can say with the numbers and the probability can be so exact that really, like, we're getting into numbers that it's bigger than the population of the world. And so DNA can be very, very exact in matching somebody. Now, that being said, you mentioned in your hypothetical, well, the same DNA was found in 4 different places. Well, I still would want to know what 4 places, right? We're talking about somebody who children were killed and a parent is the primary suspect, at least among those people that believe that the 3 convicted are innocent.
Correct.
A parent is the primary suspect at this.
A step parent, yes.
So somebody that lived with one of the victims, and somebody who we know that at least one other victim was in that person's house before they died. And so even still, again,
both of the other victims were in the house, actually, that day.
Okay, see, and that's why I say that a lot of these things can be open to interpretation, because you really have to find, I can totally imagine hypotheticals in which it's going to be very, very difficult to explain why somebody's DNA is in that specific spot. But I can also imagine other hypotheticals where it is actually quite easy to explain why your parents' DNA might be on your clothing, or,
agreed. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
What is it more difficult to explain a family friend's DNA being present at the crime scene?
It really depends on where the children had been prior in the day, right? It depends on a lot of different things.
Okay.
If that person who doesn't live with them, if we know that they were in close proximity to them, for example, I know you know the facts of the case a lot better than I do. Again, I can think of scenarios in which it would be, but I would want to know exactly where. I would want to know exactly what can be said about what is that person's alibi, for example. What were they doing that day? Did they have any reason at all to come into contact with the 3 children prior to their disappearance, right? And that's really what it's going to come down to, is you can do DNA testing and you can prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that that person's DNA is in a specific spot. Well, then if you're defending that person, now you got to figure out, okay, why is your DNA there?
Yeah.
Why is it there? And you talked about 4 spots. Well, what if it's 5? What if it's 6? What if it's 8? What if it's 10? Like, at some point, there are only so many reasonable explanations for something that a person can tolerate.
I agree.
Right?
Yes.
Like, in any situation, there are only so many things that I will accept your reasonable explanation. After that, it starts to become a really big coincidence.
Yeah.
Right? And we don't like those as juries.
Yeah, I don't believe in coincidences. Yeah, so all great points. I have another question. So, as an attorney, hopefully you know the answer to this.
Oh, I hope so. It'd be really embarrassing if I don't.
If you didn't know. So, who can bring evidence to a district attorney? Can it be anybody? Does it have to be an attorney? Does it have to be a family member of a victim? Does it have to be a police officer?
Just like in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, anybody.
Anybody. Doesn't matter who you are. You don't have to be related, be a part of the original investigation.
If you know something about a crime, please report it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Words to live by.
Yes.
Yeah. Say, if you know something, say something.
Right. That sounded a little, Gestapo, but we're not going to. No, if you have information that could assist investigators, and the district attorney, at the end of the day, they're prosecutors. They're also investigating, prosecuting crimes. It's all the same function.
Mhm.
And yeah, you don't have to have any kind of special title to call up your local law enforcement or call up your DA if you know them or you have access and say, hey, I have this person who says that they know something. And now it is on the DA or the police or the prosecutor, whoever is taking your phone call, to decide whether or not they think that it's credible or worth
Right.
following up on, or whether they think that you're just some kind of, I've spent way too many hours looking at this case online and I have a theory, right?
Mhm.
Like, you're probably not going to get listened to.
Right.
But yeah, if you have evidence and you want to go turn it in, you don't have to, you can talk to them.
All right. I think that covers all of my questions. Thank you so much for joining me today and explaining all of this to our listeners. And
Cool.
maybe
Thank
we
you.
will have you back another time.
Yeah, this stuff is fun. Thank you for trusting me.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you. We'll talk to you soon.
Alrighty, bye-bye.
I hope you all enjoyed my conversation with Rose, and now I am being joined by Clark, who is another case researcher for the Daphne Blake team. Well, welcome, Clark.
Hey, glad to be with you.
Yeah, we just found out today some pretty sad news in the case. Do you want to tell our viewers what happened today?
Yeah, it's kind of breaking news as we're recording this. We actually found out within the last hour that Jesse Kelly Sr. Sounds like he's passed away. It's posted on several of the major West Memphis 3 support Facebook pages. So I haven't had it authenticated directly except through the Facebook pages, but that seems to be the case, and which is a real tragedy to lose Jesse Kelly Sr.
That's so sad.
So I mean, he's been through a lot. He needed some answers. He kind of stood as one of the penultimate supporters, even when I would say even people in his own household didn't support his son. And a lot of the things that he said at the time, back in 1993 and 1994, still hold true today in terms of the flimsiness of some of the allegations against his son. And it's really a tragedy that he didn't get to see his this whole thing brought to some kind of finality. It's a real tragedy. He and Mark Byers are just kind of these huge characters in the case, these huge personalities in the case, and to lose them within a year of each other is just a real disaster in trying to get this thing pulled together. Yeah, we've lost quite a few people in this case. Melissa Byers. Yeah, we've lost Melissa, but we also lost Jackie Hicks Sr., who was an important searcher that night, extremely important searcher that night. We've lost, of course, Mark. And now Jesse Kelly Sr. And there's been others that, we're familiar with that are kind of lesser names in terms of the case. Not lesser in terms of people or personality, but lesser in terms of their involvement in the case, but they're still important parts. And we've been losing them, and that's a real problem. It's a real problem for this case.
Yeah, and in researching the case, we've tried to track down witnesses, police officers from the case, and have come across several that have passed away. In fact, Tony Anderson just died in 2020.
Yeah, I believe he just recently died in 2020 or something like that, very recently. And in fact, yes, that's right. He did die in 2020. It's a real big blow to this case to have lost Tony Anderson. And anybody who's familiar with the case, they've seen his maps, they've seen his diagrams. He did not testify, but he is a big part of this case.
Yeah, it's very important.
And to lose him was another big blow. So
definitely.
Yeah, it's a real tragedy. Well, we were going to talk about gosh, I mean, that's one of the sadder things to talk about, right? Losing somebody in the case. But we were going to talk about the case in general tonight anyway, and talk about Ellington. And this just kind of brings up one of the issues with prosecuting a future version of this case, which is we just keep losing witnesses left and right.
Absolutely.
So
yeah, so along with losing testimony and witnesses, we also have, issues with physical evidence that's now almost 28 years old.
Yes.
As of this year.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah. In the last 2 years, not much work has been able to get done because of the current pandemic and a lot of other things going on in the world. But and of course, the loss of Mark Byers really slowed a lot of work done for the Daphne Blake team. He was somebody we were working closely with, and not just him, but several other people close to the case. And we were getting some really good guidance. We had a question, he would answer it, no questions asked. He didn't want to know he didn't want to know what our motives were or anything. He just wanted the truth out. And, and he was very good friends with Jesse Miskelly Sr. So it's a tragic day. There's no doubt about it. This is just a really tragic day.
It's incredibly sad. How do we or the police or the prosecutors, if they so choose, how do we seek justice for Stevie, Christopher, and Michael going forward, and taking into consideration that the three who were convicted ended up taking an Alford plea?
Yeah, so that's the huge question right now in the case is, what does justice actually look like? And it depends on where you are on things as it exists right now. So if you're a non-supporter or a non, justice looks like it's already been completely destroyed, because as a non-supporter, you believe the West Memphis Three did this crime,
right?
For the reasons generally described by the prosecution, and they are now out, and there's no way to put them back in. This Alford plea has destroyed justice for you. And, I kind of understand the perspective of that they, no amount of, the only thing that evidence would do is come back and show that the prosecutor is wrong to release them, and that, that this was a bad decision made by the state.
Right, but jeopardy has attached. They can't be retried and convicted, even if somehow it was proven that they were guilty.
Exactly, because the sentence has already been imposed, which is which means life or time served plus the
correct.
The 10-year probation. So there's not much that can be done at this point. It's just done. So that's what it looks like for a non-supporter. It looks like there's no justice for them. But for the most part, most people that look at this case, and when I say most, I mean I think overwhelmingly the most. Most people look at this case and they realize that the evidence against the West Memphis Three is very, very thin. And when I say thin, it's wafer thin to almost nothing. It's a very, very strange case, just even on its merits. But it's a strange case from beginning to end, not just because of the media. But when you look into this stuff and you start saying, well, what does justice look like? Some people will say justice looks like, the West Memphis Three being exonerated and getting out of prison and having their names cleared. And that's how the defense team is going to look at justice. However, the general public, I think, wants to know who did the crimes. And I think they want to see the West Memphis Three, one way that they're dealt with, right? Their names are cleared or whatever. But the public wants to know. And so if you're a member of the public, you want to know who killed the boys. If you're on the defense team, you want exonerations. And if you're a non-supporter, you want to be proven right about your theory that the prosecution was right the entire time. I can tell you right now, as it sits, literally nobody is happy. Everybody is upset with the current state of the case.
So what do you see as the way forward to bring a conclusion to this case? What needs to be done to prove who killed Stevie, Michael, and Christopher? Well,
I had the advantage of listening to the conversation you had earlier with Rose, and she is absolutely right. It's the same conclusion that we've come to. We've actually talked to several other experts on the case, and it's going to require new evidence. And so when we hear people say things like, well, then we just need to test everything. We need to get all the DNA. Well, DNA is an easy way to do it for some things, but DNA has been done in this case. And even that didn't lead to a new prosecution. It did bring forward some new names into the case that had previously not been considered suspect, but it wasn't sufficient. So it's going to take more than just DNA to get this done. So new evidence doesn't always come in the form of DNA. It can come in the form of some new external thing that has never been touched, never been introduced into the case. It doesn't always have to be a new witness. It could just be something that was completely overlooked at the time that plays a major role in how the crime scene could be analyzed or reviewed or seen. It could be possibly a new witness. There's lots of different things. But even, here we are 28 years later almost, and many witnesses are passing away. So corroborating those witnesses could be challenging. So when we talk about new evidence, we're really talking about new physical evidence or new understanding of physical evidence.
Right.
That's there. Yeah. And unfortunately, DNA is not going to do it by itself.
Right. So if someone gets evidence retested and with new DNA methods, and it yields results, how does that help or hurt whatever other scientific evidence or witness evidence, testimony evidence that might be brought up in the pursuit of a new suspect or new suspects in this case?
Well, the key for DNA in this case, let's say that they take the bindings and they go and they do a DNA test on there that I know they do is this extraction technique where they basically vacuum out the DNA. And I know that there's a big push from a certain media source to go and do this. The problem is that doing so, one, could be slightly destructive, and two, a lot of this evidence has been held and touched and managed by people in the past. Mm-hmm. So while that information could be helpful, it will not yield justice. Let's assume that the DNA comes back and it shows that one of the suspects is, or one of the current ideas is that Terry Hobbs was involved. And so let's say that the DNA comes back and it says, yeah, no, there's Terry Hobbs' saliva is on the shoelace or something like that. He used his mouth to help tie off these knots or something. So if that's the case and that comes back, well, that's actually already kind of a known possibility because a hair matching his profile that includes him was found in one of the laces, and that wasn't sufficient. So,
new evidence that supports the evidence found in 2007 can be explained away in the same way it was explained back then.
That's right. But if you can add a new piece of evidence to it for which it is not being contradicted by new evidence, that's when it becomes supportive and helpful. So if, for example, some new supportive evidence comes in that overwhelmingly shows that Terry Hobbs was involved in this case or involved in this crime, and sure enough, they go in and they do these bindings, and they find that his DNA is on several bindings that is consistent with that binding, then that would be something they could bring up. But remember, absent that, if you go out and you do this, the first thing that you're going to do is if you go into a prosecution, you're going to bring up this DNA. The defense team is immediately going to have that DNA thrown out because they're going to say, look at all the people that touched this stuff long before. They're going to argue contamination. Yeah. So it's only in combination with new evidence is this going to happen. And this is one of the few cases where DNA alone is not going to do it because it's already been argued away.
Yeah, that's pretty fascinating.
So in other words, the new evidence has to put the DNA into a context that makes this thing airtight.
Right. So, like I was asking Rose before, what do you think about searching for and finding and convicting a new suspect in conjunction with exonerating the three who were convicted? Do you think that those have to go hand in hand? Do you think we can do one without the other? How do you think that's going to play out?
Yeah, I don't think it's possible to exonerate the West Memphis Three legally without simultaneously prosecuting somebody else. I don't think you can do it. I think that you have to have very compelling evidence of an alternative suspect that pushes in that direction. First off, they pled guilty. An Alford plea, while it is one of those really bizarre pleas, that people really dislike. It is a guilty plea, so they are legally liable for this crime. So at this point, to unwind this is going to require a very compelling piece of new evidence to do this. And like I said, if DNA by itself in 2007, 2005 all the way through 2011 is when all the DNA testing was done. So it was actually over a very large number of years. That was not sufficient to be able to bring about the outcome that they were seeking, which was exoneration. All it did was show that the amount of evidence against them was actually thinner than even the prosecutor thought at that time.
Right. Which leads into why probably part of the reasons that Scott Ellington agreed to the Alford plea when he was faced with the possibility of perhaps having to retry the case after the new DNA was uncovered in 2007. So, since then, Scott Ellington and his staff have had a tremendous amount of public pressure put on them by, celebrities, all kinds of media figures. What do you think about that? Do you think that pressure helped? I've lost my word. I don't know what I'm saying. Do you think that the public pressure that was put on Scott Ellington did any good? Did it move the case forward at all?
I think that kind of pressure that was applied when they were in prison, that pressured the criminal justice system in Arkansas to examine these three defendants, the West Memphis Three. I think that type of pressure that was applicable or that was applied then, and the results that they got, they assumed would work with Ellington and possibly his new successor. I think that's wrong. I think the evidence is very strong that Ellington doesn't do that, and prosecutors in general don't operate based upon political social pressure. The real power of the West Memphis Three movement was its ability to fundraise. I mean, they were brought and to bring a lot of eyes to the case and to fundraise and to be able to pay for the attorneys, to be able to pay for the evidence testing and all of the appeals processes, which is not normally available to people.
Right.
So they had resources that they ordinarily would not have, and that brought about new information and new understandings of existing evidence. I just want to bring this up as a side note. Judge Burnett always said there was no new evidence, and from a certain perspective, he's right. This is new understanding of old evidence, right? DNA from a hair is not new evidence. The hair had always been there. So you'll frequently hear him say there's no new evidence in the case. That's kind of a half-truth. It's really new information about old evidence. That's kind of really the more accurate version of this. So the whole situation was that they had resources that were not available to other people. Now, going forward, they didn't. I would say Burnett and the prosecution back then did not respond to public pressure the way that people think. It wasn't like they said, "Okay, we'll cave in." But people are still trying to use that same technique to try to pressure the prosecutor's office to turn over evidence to, say, a media source. That's ridiculous. You should never ever succumb to that. Turning over physical evidence in a murder case with 3 children where you still have grieving parents over to a media source for testing, even if it's something that he wants. And from what I can understand, it actually spectacularly backfired because Ellington didn't respond positively to some of the media pressure. In fact, the media pressure, from what I understand, and I know that you have some experience with talking to people in that office, that it was not well received, that they were doxxed, they got death threats, they received all kinds of stuff to the point where the Twitter account was taken down. The Twitter account was had apparently just become absolutely toxic. So this is not the way to really engage these prosecutors. I don't think that it was productive. I think that it forced them to shut doors that ordinarily would have been open to people that were interested in the case. I would say that the Daphne Blake team has had pretty good access and a very good relationship with Scott Ellington's office, and we hope to have one with the new prosecutor. But but we fully understand that the way that has to be done is through a professional, respectful way. These prosecutors just don't operate based on the public pressure model. There's no evidence that it's ever worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future. So I know people that are listening to this aren't going to necessarily like that. They're going to feel good about, giving the prosecutor heck about this, but it's not. There's no evidence that it works. In fact, there's very strong evidence that it actually is counterproductive.
Yeah, and I'd also like to mention that pressure from different sources has extended beyond legal channels. Clark, you and I have had access to some witnesses in this case who have told us that they have been harassed repeatedly through emails, through phone calls, through text messages, through people knocking on their doors, by people who want to interview them or confront them about things that they have said in the past. And that didn't work either.
That's right.
And so,
that's right.
I have, after spending some time on this case, I have a big problem with a lot of the investigators that have come before us and the tactics that they have used to try to get information from either legal sources or witnesses in this case, and it has made our job much more difficult. Do you agree?
Yeah, it's been a nightmare. Bullying witnesses and bullying family members and bullying people online and bullying the prosecutor, and even bullying other people that might have some type of information or some type of understanding of something, some skill set that they could have brought to the case, has been absolutely destructive. It's gotten to the point where there's really only a few kind of people that are working freely. Our team is one of the few that are working freely. We have very good relationships with many of the witnesses. Witnesses that refuse to speak to the media at this point, but we actually have very good connections with them. And sometimes on our channel, people ask questions about a certain witness, and we will just go and reach out to that witness and answer the question from them. So if you're asking questions on this channel, just be aware that we are listening and we are trying to get the most truthful information we can to you.
Clark, based on the current situation in this case, where do the convicted, the original West Memphis 3, stand right now as far as exoneration?
They're no closer and no further away than they were in 2011 when they got out. When we went into the files to go and see what had been going on, there has not been anything requested. There's been almost no new testing going on. There's some other stuff that's happened on the side. And we could talk about that probably at another time. But really from the defense team's whole goal was to get the West Memphis 3 out of prison. And they accomplished that. I would say that they would like to see them exonerated, but their goal was to get Damian Eccles off death row and the other two men out of prison. And that mission was largely accomplished. And so the Alford plea kind of put some finality on that in terms of saving Damian's life and getting the other two out. So in terms of them asking for new testing and pushing that, I can understand the nons asking the question, and you do see it whenever you speak to them. They say, why aren't they asking for new testing? Why aren't they asking for this and whatever? And, of course, when you hear it from the West Memphis 3 themselves, they'll say, we are in favor of new testing. We are in favor of more DNA. We want this done. But the attorneys are not moving. And largely, it's because their job is done. Their job is to keep them out of prison. I think that an exoneration would be wonderful, but that might not be something that they see as on the table in any immediate sense, right? Sometimes you got to take
bonus.
If they could get it, right? If they could get it, And I think that's kind of where that puts this whole thing at. A lot of people think that, if new evidence came forward, you have to give it to the defense team because the defense team is going to use it to solve the crime. And that's not necessarily the truth. I'm not saying that they wouldn't. What's that?
Or their job. It's not their job to solve the crime.
Yeah, it's not their job to solve the crime. Their job is to represent the West Memphis 3. I'm not saying that if they got some type of evidence that showed who actually did the crime, they wouldn't turn it over. They absolutely would turn it over.
Right.
However, this the paperwork and the evidence and everything that's in this case is so expansive, it's so huge, that if they got a piece of information and they weren't unaware of it, they could accidentally sit on it for years not realizing that this could be the thing that breaks the case open. And because their goal is not to solve the case per se, but to just make sure that their clients stay out of prison.
And do you think that they also understand, as you just explained to everyone, that new DNA testing is not going to be what solves this crime?
Oh, I think they're keenly aware of that. That's not going to be persuasive to the prosecution. It's not going to be persuasive to the jury in and of itself. So coming out and taking a lace and, if you take the lace off Stevie and it comes back and it matches Terry Hobbs, for example, just throwing it out there, that's not going to be sufficient for a prosecution against Terry Hobbs. Now, the public might say, oh, see, we've always thought that it was him. We're going to go ahead and push for that. And they're going to try him in the media, but that's not going to give you the pathway to justice in a legal sense. That's not going to give you your exoneration. That's not going to give you a future prosecution if it turns out that that's what the evidence points out. So you have to always keep an eye on a future prosecution, and that's one thing that you have to give credit to Ellington for, is he preserved the evidence in light of the chance that there might be new evidence that could force a future prosecution for somebody other than the West Memphis Three, which would simultaneously generate an exoneration.
And let's also give him credit for accepting the Alford plea, because he didn't have to do that.
That's right.
He could have let the special counsel that was appointed by the Arkansas Supreme Court to decide whether or not the West Memphis Three deserved a new trial make their decision. He could have waited and heard whether they said yes or no, but he went ahead and accepted their pleas and let them out of prison, and he doesn't get credit for that.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, they're all, in terms of a physical sense, they're effectively exonerated, right? They're not legally exonerated, but they're not in prison, even though they've accepted responsibility for this murder. I mean, that's the paradox of the Alford plea. And a lot of people will say, well, Ellington's actually on record saying this, that he was not looking forward to a new trial. He did not want to go back and restudy the case. And I actually have no idea how well he understands the case or knows the case. I know it's been kind of sitting in his office for years now, or was sitting in his office for years. He's not in that office anymore. But a lot of people will say, well, he was afraid of a future prosecution, and that possibly was true. But that's not a foregone conclusion that he would have lost a retrial. He, by all accounts, is a very good attorney and a very good prosecutor. And they were convicted once before. They could have very easily have been convicted again. And so this was a gamble on both sides. Mm-hmm. And I think that honestly, this is one of those deals in criminal justice history that's going to be just studied forever. But he used to call it a maggot sandwich, and it absolutely is. That's in many ways that's an understatement for how nasty this deal has turned out to be for everybody involved. I mean, nobody is happy out of this situation. And least of all, besides the victims' families and of course, the three convicted, the prosecution's office has been under siege by the media outlets and media personalities for the better part of a decade. And this is a prosecutor that did not try the case. I know that people have sent him some very, very nasty, comments, doxing, accused him of being complicit with the murder, which makes him effectively a murderer himself. They've made death threats. And when I say doxing, I know that he has been, people have handed out his personal information, including his personal phone number, his wife's phone number, and they've been getting it everywhere. So it's a really, really toxic situation. It's not the way that people at this stage of the investigation should be conducting themselves. If that worked at the beginning to get the West Memphis Three out and to raise money, to raise awareness, that's great. But that technique doesn't work for this.
Yeah, I agree, and it's a bad precedent. It needs to stop. That should not happen again to Ellington or the new DA or anyone ever. That's not the way to win.
Yeah, you're just out there manufacturing victims to get what you want, and that's. Yeah. I mean, if you're going to accuse the prosecution of bullying the system to get these three persons, the three defendants convicted, then you can't be a bully yourself. I mean, you have to play the professional game. You have to play the long game. And I know it's frustrating, and I know a lot of people want to say, hey, let's just get this done. But if you do it wrong, and the evidence goes to, say, a media personality who could potentially destroy some of that evidence during the testing, then it can't be used in a prosecution. And then your pathway or your gateway to justice on this case is shut forever. It will never be reopened. So this has to be very delicately handled. I guess we just have to just kind of be aware it just comes with the case. And I'll tell you, the internet trolls are out of control. That's the biggest part. So, that's the biggest impediment. And they're going to attack Ellington. They're going to attack you. They're going to attack each other. It's just a shit show. These guys, they don't care.
Nope. They're anonymous behind their keyboards, and they don't realize what kind of real danger they're putting people in.
Well, they're preventing one of the most infamous crimes in Arkansas history, and certainly, it probably is the most infamous crime in Arkansas history.
For sure.
And certainly one of the top 25 in the country.
Yeah.
They're making it so that the case cannot go forward because it's become a soap opera more than anything else. So it's crazy. People do not understand the damage that they do. And I'm not saying that the families haven't played some role in this. I mean, Mark himself used to admit that he was a big problem in getting into these documentaries and acting the way that he acted and getting drunk and high and arrested and going before the media. And I mean, he was not shy to get in front of the camera and do things that he later on deeply regretted doing. And he's not the only one that's done that. I'm not here to name names, but he's the one that owned that while he was alive. And the other ones won't own it. But there's also a lot of people, when the nons like to bring up people getting paid. Hey, a lot of people are getting paid on this crime, and it's not just the families are getting paid. There are witnesses that have been paid and other things. So it's a bad situation. This is a really, really toxic, bad case, and people do not understand what is going on behind the camera. All they see is what the camera and what the audio is telling them. They do not understand everything that they need to know when they make judgment calls or when they send out a horrible telegram or a horrible postcard or an email to a secretary in Ellington's office, who is incidentally one of the most lovely people I have ever met. So they have no idea what they're doing.